Well, welcome back. For this unit, we have moved away from the textbook again to take a closer look at teaching vocabulary. So you should have read the article, the chapter by Cheryl Boyd Zimmerman before watching this lecture. If you haven't had a chance to do that, just go ahead and pause the video, read that chapter, and then come on back. So let's start, as we often do, considering why this topic is important for us as teachers of English language learners. Why is it important to teach vocabulary to ELLs? Think about that for a moment. Well, as you can imagine, there are a lot of good reasons. Vocabulary makes up a big part of what it means to know and use a language, but there are especially important implications when it comes to reading and writing. So in terms of reading, the research consistently demonstrates that vocabulary knowledge correlates more highly with reading comprehension than other factors, including morphosyntactic knowledge, or grammar, and reading strategies. So more than the ability to use and understand grammar, and more than using reading comprehension strategies, vocabulary knowledge puts English language learners ahead when it comes to reading. And once you have a good chunk of vocabulary, you can use it to develop more vocabulary. So this idea of the rich get richer. Readers can utilize the vocabulary that they know to acquire more vocabulary. Also, in terms of writing, a relationship exists between the richness of vocabulary in writing, a learner's level of proficiency, and raters' assessment of the quality of writing. So when ELLs gave writing samples to a study, it was determined that the richness of their vocabulary was related to their higher level of English proficiency, and raters of their writing rated their quality of writing as higher. It's also the case that our learners themselves see a lack of vocabulary as the major factor affecting their writing. They will often identify that as, I just don't have the words to express what it is that I want to write. So when we think about teaching vocabulary, where should we start? Which words are important? Which words do we prioritize? Well, Paul Nation is one of the foremost experts on vocabulary acquisition, second language vocabulary acquisition, and he says there is a group of high-frequency words that are the most important vocabulary learning goal. These words are so frequently and widely used that they need to be well learned as quickly as possible. They deserve all kinds of attention from teachers and learners. And what are those words? Well, by high-frequency words, many experts would argue that you start with the words that occur most frequently in English, and then you rank them. So here's the list of the most basic and frequent 10 words in the English language. The, be, of, and, a, to, in, he, have, it, right? So pretty basic functional words that we have to have in English to be able to do much with the language. In 1953, Michael West developed what's known as the GSL, the General Service List of English words. It's been updated since the 50s, but the concept is that you take the most widely useful words in the English language. They cover about 80% of an average academic text. They're about 80% of the words in an average academic text. And they include about 2,000 word families. Now, word families are all the words that come from the same base word. So, for example, develop, development, developing, undeveloped, etc. Those all count as one word family that comes from one base word, develop, not as separate words in those 2,000 word families. So the General Service List is divided into what's known as the K1 and the K2. So the first 1,000 level words and the second 1,000 level words that are most commonly used in English. So in the K1, the first 1,000, we would find words like the, be, of, by, but also often, work, think, doctor, day, where, and people. The first 1,000 words that we would typically frequently use. And in the second 1,000 words, the K2, we're going to find things like deliver, hurry, quarter, birth, weather, ancient, silent, etc. So these are really frequently used words, but the K1 are the most frequent, the K2 are the second 1,000 most frequent. And you can see examples as we go on. There are also another high frequency word list that was developed by Coxhead in 2000, and it was for identifying the most frequently used words in academic contexts. So the GSL, the General Service List, was for just commonly used language, and about 80% of it would pop up in academic texts. But the AWL, the Academic Word List, was really for use in academic contexts. So includes about 570 head words, and it's not connected to any specific discipline. So it's not a lot of words from biology or accounting or linguistics. They're words that you would find in academic contexts across different disciplines. There are 10 sublists in the academic word list based on their frequency. And they compose about 9% of an academic text. So if you looked at an academic text, about 9% of the words in it would be from the AWL. So I mentioned sublists, and the first sublist is the most frequently used of those 570 words. So it's going to, again, these are academic words, so they're going to be words that you're going to find in a lot of different academic subjects, but data, assess, theory, vary. When you get to kind of the middle list, the sublist 5, you'll find words like facilitate, network, logic, image, maybe less frequently used academic words. And then at the final list, the sublist 10, we're going to find intrinsic, undergo, integrity. So again, those are the least frequent, and you're going to find the sublist 10 words less frequently than, say, the sublist 1 words. But remember, these are not specific to a certain discipline, but are general to academic texts. So when we think about teaching vocabulary and how many words our students need to know, I'm curious what you think. What percentage of words in a text do you think a reader needs to know in order to understand that text? Think about what you think that number is now. 50%, 60, 70%. Many people will say 80%, but let's have a look. At 80% comprehension of the words in a text, you will read it something like this. Grajnik asked what they were thinking about, and if there was speaking or thinking and a raffliddle going on, and if so, what raffliddle it was. Then after the subjects had gone through a Pluncini cycle, they were blurmbo up and asked if they had roongluli, if there had been any raffliddle in the roong, and if so, what raffliddle it was. The results, like rungu themselves, are hard to quatrif. The clearest syncrep was that you could influence the raffliddle in the room with the raffliddle nangbo in the pre-nunlap interview, but all the rungfu reported rungniddle in their raffludlu. So I think maybe at 80% comprehension of words, we're not going to be able to read a text. At 95% comprehension of the words in a text, you're going to read it like this. Researchers asked what they were thinking about, and if there was speaking or thinking in a language going on, and if so, what language it was. Then after the subjects had gone through a REM cycle, they were blurmbo up and asked if they had dreamed, if there had been language in the dream, and if so, what language it was. The results, like dreams themselves, are hard to quatrif. The clearest singrep was that you could influence the language in the dream with the language nangbo in the pre-nunlap interview. But all the dreamers reported dreaming in both their languages. So it's a lot better at 95%. But it seems to me that that last section, there's still a lot of words we don't know, and it's even still hard to use the context to figure out what that last section means. So other than the percentage, so the percentage might be much higher than we thought. With less than 90% of words known, comprehension is difficult or impossible, like we saw with that 85%. With 90 to 95% known, comprehension is possible, but with resources. So with a dictionary, with some amount of discussion, with a content lecture, some amount of teaching happening that would allow the student to understand those 10 to 5% of words they still don't know. With greater than 95% known, independent reading becomes feasible. Independent reading. Between 95 and 98% comprehension, fluency will improve. So until students have access to 95 to 98% of those words, their reading fluency is not going to increase. And then between 95 and 98% comprehension, their comprehension will improve. Once you get above 98%, the text can be used for reading to learn rather than learning to read. That's a phrase we often hear, I think, in early childhood, that you start education by learning to read so that you can read to learn. And it's not so different when it comes to ELLs of all ages, that there needs to be a high level of vocabulary comprehension so that reading can be for the purpose of learning and not still learning to read. Well, there's a very useful tool on the web for identifying troubling vocabulary, and it's a website called LexTutor, and there's the URL for it here. I'm going to show you a bit of it today, and you're going to notice that the site looks pretty simple. It's not sleek, it's maybe outdated, in some ways it's hard to navigate, but it is quite useful, and you need to spend some time kind of poking around it to find exactly how useful it is. I'm not going to go through it step by step here today because there's a video ant tutorial that walks you through how to use it, and there's step-by-step instructions in an activity you're going to be doing as well for this unit. Many of you may be familiar with the children's book Babar the Elephant. It's a children's book, so we wouldn't expect very complex vocabulary in it. But when we put Babar the Elephant, the text of it, into the LexTutor vocabulary profiler, there in the box on the left, the white, that's the text. And then that same text shows up on the right side, color-coded. So we see there's some blue text, some green text, some red text. And the blue text are the K1 words. Remember the K1 words that we just learned about from the general service list? Those blue words are amongst the 1,000 most common words in English on the general service list. The green words are from the K2, so they're the second 1,000 word families from the general service list. If there had been any text in yellow, those would be the academic word list. And then the red are off list, so words that don't show up on academic word list or general service list. So sometimes those are proper nouns, or they're just words that are so kind of unusual they don't show up. So you're going to see babars on there. But then also automobiles, which is a little bit unexpected, maybe because it's kind of old-fashioned. Nowadays we would just say cars. But so when we look at the green, elephant, trunk, digging, sand, shell, wicked hunter, those are all going to be words that might be slightly more challenging for an English language learner than some of the blue words, which are going to be much more common. Great, forest, little, name, mother, etc. If you scroll down on that same page, you would see that it kind of breaks the K1 words, the 1 to 1,000, into their percentages, the K2 words into their percentages, the AWL words into its percentage, and the off-list words into their percentages. So you can get a sense of how many, what the percentage is of each of those words from each of those lists. Now, I took an abstract from a research publication, so a very academic text. Obviously, this is going to contain very different vocabulary than a children's book. So the text, we paste it in on the white section on the left, and then on the right, we see it color-coded. And you probably notice right away that there's a lot fewer blue words, a lot fewer K1. There are also fewer green words, right? The K2 words are far fewer. But now in yellow, those AWL words, there's lots of them. We see unified, processes, factors, motivation, primary, source, attachment bonding, available, etc. And then there's also a lot of off-list words, so a lot of these red words that you'll see: instinct, caregiver, conspecifics, interactional instinct. So a lot more words that are definitely going to be challenging and need to be pre-taught to an ELL. Here again, we see the percentages, just 66%, K1 3.5%, K2 14.2%, AWL, and 15% off list. So when we compare these two texts, Babar and then that abstract by Schumann, we can see that although they have a similar number of words, the K1 and K2 words, there's just far more of them in Babar, far fewer of them in Schumann. AWL, none of them in Babar, many, many of them in Schumann, and so on. It'll also give you the root of those words, whether they're Anglo-Saxon or Greco-Latin French. That's probably not as important to you for your purposes. But what is helpful about this is that being able to see the kind of vocabulary items in a text that can be identified as challenging, basically anything above K1, and certainly anything on the AWL, are going to be those words that you're going to want to pre-teach, and which ones are going to be far above some of the levels of your students, depending on their proficiency level. When we think about teaching vocabulary, one thing to keep in mind is that in English, many words have multiple meanings. That's what we call polysemy. Polysemy. It means a word having multiple meanings. So if you think about the word fine, how would you define the word fine? Well, there's actually a lot of meanings. It can mean very good. I'm feeling fine today. How are you feeling today? Well, I'm fine. Kind of means okay. Could you please go start the laundry? Fine, if I have to. Maybe very piece of fine sand or small particles are very small and hard to see. Fine slices or fine layers would be very thin, made of small grains, again, like a fine sand. A fine could be a sum of money that you have to pay. Or to find someone is to make them pay an amount of money. So in English, we have a lot of words like that that mean a lot of different things. I bet you can think of a lot of them. And when we think about what it means to know a word, we have to think about a variety of factors. So that includes the pronunciation of that word, its correct intonation, the way our tone goes up and down when we say it, its spelling, any synonyms or antonyms that might exist, words that mean the same or the opposite, the level of formality of a word, whether it's a very sort of casual word or if it's going to be used only in a more formal setting, the gradations of its meaning, and that's kind of what I refer to with fine. It's part of speech, whether it's an adjective, noun, verb, etc., prefixes and suffixes that can be attached to it, and any collocations. Now, you had a video in a previous unit about collocations, but there might still be some misunderstanding about what these are. So there are certain words that co-occur with other words with more than random frequency. So words that kind of go together in English. So the word good, we would frequently hear good morning, good night, good afternoon, good evening, but we don't greet someone at noon by saying good noon or good lunchtime. We just don't. They don't collocate. The word make, we talk about make a mistake, make the bed, make a cake, make a mess. We don't talk about making our homework. So collocations are the company that a word keeps, the words that go with that word at more than just a random frequency. So when we think about collocations, think about what's wrong with the sentences that follow. The man is 6 feet high. No, we wouldn't say that. You understand the meaning, but the collocation's wrong. The man is 6 feet tall. The Taj Mahal is made of white marbles. White marble, which is a little different. Marbles are those circular little balls made of, rock, but marble is a kind of mineral that is a material you could make something out of. So that doesn't collocate. My initial name is Maria and my final name is Rodriguez. We know what she means, but first name, last name. The children made their homework. They did their homework. It makes sense. And in other languages, make and do, it's the same word. But it doesn't collocate in English to make your homework. He asked for a piece of masticating gum. That's kind of what I meant with that formality. It means the same thing, masticating, chewing, but we just don't say it in everyday language, masticating. We say chewing gum. Another important part of vocabulary development is understanding word parts and word formation. So prefixes and suffixes, the parts that we attach to the beginning of words or the end of words, and their meanings, we need to explicitly teach those to our students. So they need to know that un makes it negative, pre means before, at the end of, like after a verb, makes that person an agent. Shun makes a word a noun. Able makes a word an adjective. So for example, the word pre-registration, pre, before, register, that's the base word, and then shun turns a verb into a noun. And so teaching that kind of word formation can be really helpful and important because once students learn what those suffixes mean, they can transfer that knowledge to other words. So it can be useful to use word formation charts to teach students to find other words in that same word family that are a different part of speech. So here the verb is given on the left, and the student must find the noun and find the adjective. So from write, they must find writer, written, develop, development, developed, frustrate, frustration, frustrated, bleed, blood, bloody. So, as you can see, vocabulary learning seems like a big task, but there are many things that students can do and many things that teachers can do. And so first, students can use vocabulary cards that contain some or all of these things: the meaning of the word in their first language or in English, its spelling, any collocations that go with that word, its pronunciation, part of speech, any word family members, and maybe a sample sentence. These can actually be really useful for students to build their own decks of vocabulary cards as they're acquiring new words. It's also a good idea to get students in the habit of keeping vocabulary notebooks so they can when they meet a new word, copy it down, its source, where they found that word, maybe a sample sentence, the meaning of it. So that could be a translation from their first language or maybe a synonym, the pronunciation again, any collocations, part of speech, maybe a picture. Those are often helpful, and any other meanings of that word. It's also important that vocabulary be taught with spaced repetition rather than crammed drilling. So instead of studying a group of words for a long period of time, study for a brief period. Set those words aside, come back to them later. You've probably had the experience of cramming for a test and then after the exam you immediately forget all of the facts. And it's the same with vocabulary development. The kind of spaced repetition of studying words, setting them aside, coming back to them later allows the brain to process that material more effectively. And as for your role as a teacher, it's first just important to understand how English works. If you're not clear on a lot of these things that I've been talking about with prefixes, suffixes, word formation, the definition of words and what's their part of speech, it's hard for us to teach our students. Teach that vocabulary explicitly. Don't just expect students to pick words up by reading or hearing. It's important, especially for these more challenging words, to identify them and pre-teach them, teach them explicitly as we go. Teach the words the students need to know and not just fancy words. So don't get hung up on some of these words that seem like that'll make them sound smart. Make sure that they know, make sure we're focusing on these most frequently used words first and then move on from there. Provided feedback on their vocabulary usage. So students are trying out a new word and doing well with it, praise them. If they're trying out another word and they don't use it right, acknowledge, hey, I like that you're using that new word. Let me tell you a little bit more about what it means to help provide some corrective feedback. Raise their awareness of words and their usage. So that can mean putting certain words in bold text, drawing them out of the text and putting them up on the board so that we can talk about and raise awareness of the usage of those keywords. Encourage your more advanced students to use academic word list synonyms. So find words that are from the academic word list and identify synonyms. Help them to look carefully at those, analyze those words. Provide opportunities for repetition. So come back to these words again and again and revisit their meanings, the shades of meaning. They're looking at them from a different angle. Teach word families, again, develop, development, undeveloped, help students to make those connections. And then teach the grammar of words, how we put words together with other words, and that's also kind of the what we talked about, morphology, how a word changes shape with prefixes, affixes, tenses that change its meaning. Some things teachers shouldn't do, should try to avoid doing, are teaching words that sound or look alike that have similar meanings in the same lesson. So don't teach jog, sprint, and run at the same time. Don't teach glimmer, glitter, and gleam all together. It's just confusing. And again, don't forget to recycle vocabulary items that students have learned. Don't assume that once they've learned a word, it's somehow permanently emblazoned in their brain. Come back to those words because repetition and recycling is always going to be important and helpful. So have a look at that task list for details on all our activities for Unit 9, and I will see you soon.